Dans la réunion
I call
numéro...
this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 107 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, February 21st, 2024, the committee meets to discuss on its Canada Infrastructure's Bank involvement in the Lake Erie Connector project. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and therefore members are attending in person in a room and remotely using the Zoom application.
This room is equipped with a sophisticated audio system. Feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to our interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too closely to a microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of our interpreters, I invite all participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. Colleagues, I'd like to now welcome our witnesses for today. Appearing before us is Mr. Mark Winfield, Professor, Faculty of Environment and Urban Change from York University, appearing by video conference. Welcome to you, sir. And from the Canada Infrastructure Bank, we have Aaron Corey, Chief Executive Officer, Sachin Gunaratna, Managing Director, Investments, and Frédéric Duguay, General Counsel and Corporate Security. We begin with our opening remarks, and for that I will turn the floor over to you, Mr. Winfield. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Mark Winfield. I'm a professor of environmental and urban change at York University in Toronto. I'm also coordinator of the Master Environmental Studies and Master Environmental Studies Juris Doctor programs, and a member of the University Senate and co-chair of the Sustainable Energy Initiative at the university, although I emphasize I'm speaking today in my capacity as an individual and not on behalf of York University as an institution. I've written extensively on energy, electricity, environment, and climate change issues in Canada, particularly Ontario. I've been a member of NSERC and SHRC-funded research networks on energy storage, smart grids, community energy planning, and transportation and climate change. And I'm a founding advisory member of the Energy Modeling Hub. Most recently, I was co-editor of Sustainable Energy Transitions in Canada, which was published by UBC Press last fall. With respect to the Lake Erie Connector, this project was first brought to my attention via the media inquiries about 3 years ago now, I guess. And I must admit, my first reaction was it just didn't make a lot of sense, given what was happening with electricity in Ontario. The notion that the province is going to be a position to export clean electricity to the U.S. markets simply did not accord with the generally accepted situation on the ground in the province. Put bluntly, there is no clean electricity to export, and we don't foresee any probably out into the 2040s at the best. The province's nuclear fleet is at end of life, with all 3 plants scheduled to have units going offline for refurbishment or retirement. The procurement of renewable energy was formally terminated in 2018, although in fact that had stopped earlier around 2014, and the province's energy efficiency strategy was terminated in 2019. The current government had declined to engage with Quebec around the possibility of interjurisdictional exports and imports, despite repeated offers from the Quebec side to do so. The province is now actually projecting and now seeing a major increase in greenhouse gas emissions and nitrogen oxide emissions from gas-fired generation. That's now up by a factor of 3 relative to the low point in 2017 in the aftermath of the coal phase-out, and it is now on almost a vertical growth curve, looking at a 5-time increase by the late 2020s, and that will continue through the 2030s. There are IESO projections which indeed saw ongoing growth in natural gas generation and related emissions through the 2040s. The implication here is that the marginal fuel in Ontario for the foreseeable future will be fossil gas fired, and therefore not clean as has been generally understood. And the situation did beg the question about what level of understanding of the situation on the ground in Ontario was informing the decision making and the level of due diligence in financing the project, which I understand is now on indefinite hold. Also have to note, similar questions have arisen around the infrastructure bank's role as the, at the moment, only significant investor in the proposed nuclear reactor at the OPG Darlington site. Again, lots of questions. This is technology that does not exist even as a prototype. There is no construction license. The technology is different from anything the CNSC, the nuclear regulator, has seen before. There are debates within the CNSC itself about how it should even approach the review and approval of the project, and many serious technical and economic questions about the technology, reinforced by the failure of the flagship NuScale SMR initiative at the end of last year. Just to finish up, implications here, it does seem there needs to be a higher level of due diligence on the infrastructure's part, bank's part in making investment decisions. That could be helped by engaging with not just the relevant proponents and authorities, but also to make sure there are discussions with people with knowledge and understanding of the local systems and issues within the academy and civil society. There is a very definite need to reach beyond proponents and their lobbyists. I've been an external advisor on audits for the Auditor General and the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development. And this is part of the audit practice. It's a way of ground truthing where they're going with their audit findings in terms of people with understanding the situation on the ground. I think this is very relevant in this case because I think there is a very serious need to separate the sales pitches around what's being portrayed as clean or green technology from the realities of their technical and economic status and viability. And I think I'll end there, and we'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Winfield. We'll now turn the floor over to Mr. Corey. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Mesdames et Messieurs, les membres du comité.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. As stated, my name is Aaron Corey, and I'm the CEO of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, or CIB. I'm joined by Frederic Duguay, General Counsel and Corporate Secretary, as well as Sachin Gunaratna, who leads investments in the clean power sector. In order to testify and answer questions from the committee, we are pleased to be with you today and to accept the invitation to testify as part of your study of the participation of CIB in the Lake Erie Connector project.
Canada needs more infrastructure. It's a fact that's widely accepted and understood. Whether that's transmission lines like the Lake Erie Connector that allows Canadian energy to move between markets across our country and to other jurisdictions, ports and airports that help Canadians export more and get to new markets, or projects like water and wastewater systems that enable more housing stock. We need more investment in infrastructure. And government alone can't pay for all this infrastructure. Tax dollars are finite, and we need the private sector to do its part as well. Too often, we hear from infrastructure owners that their projects are sitting on the sidelines as they struggle to address the barriers to getting shovels in the ground. And that's where the CIB comes in. We use innovative financing tools to de-risk investment and incentivize the private sector to spend on the infrastructure that, without the CIB, might not get built. We deliver value for taxpayers by making loans that get paid back with interest. It is this flywheel of investment that makes the CIB unique relative to other forms of government support for infrastructure projects. Before I talk about the Lake Erie Connector, just another moment about the CIB and our progress. Over the last 3 years, the CIB has really hit its stride. We have now made more than 70 investments that have reached financial close, investing nearly $13 billion of taxpayer money in projects in every region of Canada. These projects have a total capital cost of nearly $35 billion, and each of them are real investments in real projects that address Canada's infrastructure gap. Projects like the Accenture Passenger and Cargo Airport in Thompson, Manitoba, that delivers critical service to 37 northern, remote, and Indigenous communities in the north. Investments that support cities like Brandon, Manitoba, with water and wastewater treatment facilities, without which new housing can't get built. Or battery storage facilities in partnership with Nova Scotia Power and the WMA, an economic development corporation owned by the 13 Mi'kmaq nations in the province that will help decarbonize the Nova Scotia grid. Two of the projects we've invested in are now completed, and another, the first phase of the REM transit system in Montreal, is also now operational. So we are seeing the results of these investments. Now, let me speak to the Lake Erie Connector and the focus of today's discussion. The Lake Erie Connector is a prime example of an infrastructure project that could potentially deliver public good outcomes, yet has been stuck on the sidelines for a decade. The project is a cross-border transmission line that will reduce GHGs on both sides of the border, provide a more resilient power grid, and drive positive GDP for Ontario by connecting to the largest wholesale electricity market in the world. Yet, like many other projects, it has been sidelined due to an affordability gap. The project was initially proposed in 2014, but despite strong rationale for the investment and public support from the Government of Ontario and the Independent Electricity System Operator, the project was stuck due to high costs that would have had a significant impact on Ontario ratepayers. The CIB became involved in 2019, and after analyzing both the expected cost of the project and GHG and economic benefits, we agreed to make a $655 million loan that would reduce the project's total cost and minimize impacts to ratepayers. However, COVID and inflation then took hold, and in the face of rapid cost escalation, Fortis, the owner of the project at the time, suspended the project. As a result, the $655 million investment commitment from the CIB did not proceed to close, and the funds were never spent. Now, for every one of our investments we've made to date and will make, we undertake a rigorous risk-benefit analysis to determine if the project is in the best interest of Canadians. This due diligence is a normal part of making responsible investments. In the case of Lake Erie, we sought expert advice to help us understand and ensure the value for taxpayers through due diligence. The total cost related to all the due diligence in this project were about $900,000, which represents less than 0.14% of the total investment size. And it is, of course, possible and even likely that there will be projects like the Lake Erie Connector that will be paused, delayed, or canceled due to external factors. This is a natural part of the investment cycle. But as we often experience in large infrastructure projects, they often return, as is the case with the Lake Erie Connector. And I'm pleased to share that discussions on this project have recently resumed under the leadership of NextEra, who acquired Fortis's rights to the project, as well as the IESO. And the CIB has engaged in several recent meetings on the project. Thank you. I look forward to the members' questions and the dialogue over the next few hours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corey. We're going to line of questioning today with Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you for coming again, Mr. Corey, nice to see you again. You're becoming a permanent fixture here. It's good to have you back. I just wanted to ask you a few questions that are related specifically to the Lake Erie Connector project. And by way of background, we know that in April 2021, the Liberal government and the Canada Infrastructure Bank announced their partnership with Fortis, a private company that makes billions of dollars in revenues every year. And the plan was to build a new underwater transmission line, promising tons of low-carbon energy, billions in GDP, and hundreds of jobs for Canadians. Now, had the project been viable, it would have brought jobs even to my community of Haldimand, Norfolk. The bank offered Fortis through its subsidiary a $655 million investment loan, and I understand that the project was canceled or has been suspended. So even though no official work began on the project, the CIB managed to spend close to $1 million on bonuses, and that was largely spent on consultants and lawyers. My first question to you, Mr. Curry, is where did the $900,000 of taxpayers' money go?
Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for the question. Thank you, Chair. In each of our investments, when they reach the stage of an investment commitment, as this project did, we undertake a set of due diligence. And in this case, the due diligence really had two forms. One, you can imagine in a loan of this size, there's a decent amount of legal work to structure the investment. This is particularly true in a transmission line that goes across international borders. So we had both legal counsel in Canada, who were our main counterparts helping us to structure the deal, write the loan agreements, et cetera, but also in the U.S. to help us understand how interjurisdictional rules would work, tax treatment, that sort of thing. So that's the legal support we had, and that's the majority of the due diligence. The other kind, which is very relevant to Dr. Winfield's comments, was on technical due diligence, understanding the impact of the line and the projected flow of electricity, both directions on the line. Now, I will say the independent system operator did the first and most important part of this work. That is their role. But we wanted to have an independent view, so we hired consultants, technical advisors who understand electricity markets, have detailed models, who help model for us how electricity would flow over the line, both trade from Ontario to the US, but also at times when Ontario needed to import, because over the course of the year, electricity would flow both ways on this line. So we were modeling those flows. That's where we spent the due diligence money. And as in any large transaction, I think that's money well spent and taxpayer money well used.
Okay, well, money well spent. The money is of no value now because the project is canceled. So you're confirming that $900,000 of taxpayers' money has now been wasted because the project is now canceled, and you can't use that information from consultants because the project doesn't exist anymore. It's suspended.
Thank you. Quite the contrary. The project actually suspended. Your last statement, absolutely correct. The project was suspended, and let's just go back. This is 21-22. Ontario determined the price they were willing to pay for this line. It was a fixed price offered by the independent system operator, by the province of Ontario, to Fortis at the time. And cost escalation in construction, I don't have to tell committee members here what was happening in our construction markets.
Very simple. That the project is suspended, so the $900,000 is basically wasted money. It's gone.
Not at all. The project is live. The new owner of the project, named NextEra, who are a large transmission operator, have restarted their work. Like many infrastructure projects, one of the first things someone taught me in this industry is every project dies a few times before it really lives. This project was suspended, but it continues apace. It is a necessary part of the transmission grid in North America, and we still think it'll get built.
Okay, let me ask you something about the viability of projects. Now, companies like, say, organizations like, say, the United Nations, they often fund projects. And when the projects fail, the company pays for it, not the organization. The company that has had the contract, they eat those costs. Why doesn't the CIB have a policy like that?
Well, the CIB is an investor, and different than other forms of government, we invest our money, we charge interest. And so the way we get paid back is we get our money back with interest. And across all of our portfolio investments, we size our loans to get projects to happen, to make them affordable to ratepayers, but to get paid back. And so when we get paid back in our projects across our portfolio, that more than covers our due diligence costs. So we will be repaid across the portfolio. Now,
so why don't you hedge your risk? Why don't you, as an investor, decide that you will invest after the viability of the project? Did Fortis not announce that they had sought all the permits and they were ready to go before you invested?
Absolutely. And as part of our natural due diligence, we always ensure that permits are received.
So what did you spend on lawyers $1 million for? Some of the lawyers reference permits. So if the permits were already confirmed, why are you wasting additional money on lawyers for permits that were already confirmed?
To be very clear, the achievement of permits is the problem of the project proponent, in this case, Fortis. We did not pay for them to get permits. We paid to do our due diligence to make sure all permits were received and in good order, and the project was investable. The only thing that changed in the project was significant cost escalation. This is a highly technical project. You're burying a cable under the lake, and in 2021, 2022, cost of projects went up dramatically. Ontario had offered a fixed price. Fortis could no longer make the project work, even with our investment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corey. Next, we'll go to Ms. Murray. Ms. Murray, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thanks for the information that you've provided, and Professor Winfield as well. So I'm just going to follow up on the conversation about due diligence. Mr. Winfield suggested that further due diligence might be required, and so could you tell us whether and how you plan to increase the due diligence on this project?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. And maybe just I'll start, if I may, I'll be brief, but just to recap on the due diligence around the project, it's really important. And of course, I defer, Dr. Winfield is an expert in this subject, but I just want to talk about what our due diligence and the due diligence that came from the independent system operator, who committee members may have a chance to speak to. I don't know the other witnesses, but I would recommend it. What their analysis showed, remembering that power systems work through the 8,760 hours in a year, and there are some hours of the day when Ontario is long, clean power. It might be the middle of the night, and the wind is blowing and demand in Ontario is low, the nuclear plants may be running, etc. And so what our due diligence showed that in those moments there were opportunity for Ontario to economically benefit from exporting clean power to the US, to the largest wholesale market in the world called PJM, the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland market. That would equate to, over the first decade of this line, 4 million tons of GHG savings from Ontario Power going to the US. 7 million savings from Ontario Power going to the US. There was also times in the year when Ontario would import power over the line. That might be when the nuclear plants need to shut down for maintenance, where it's not windy, where it's a particularly hot or cold day in Ontario and you need to bring power in. And the ISO's modeling suggested that they would be able to buy that power from PJM in those moments and avoid turning on gas plants in those peak moments in Ontario. So there were, over that same period, the first decade of the line, 4 million of GHG savings in Ontario. And I take my time on that because it's important. Some people say, well, how can there be savings on both sides of the border? Well, the answer is because there's a lot of hours in a year, and sometimes the electrons are flowing one way and some the other. But I'm not a power market expert, and so the ISO, the Independent Electricity System Operator, that's their job. They have a pretty complicated hour-by-hour model of the Ontario power grid. That's their modeling. We hired a consultancy called PA Consulting, who understand power markets very well, to do a due diligence on that, to scrutinize that, to make sure that that was in the interest of taxpayers, and they verified that that made sense. To answer your question, as the project restarts, as I was saying to Dr. Lewis, this project was yes, suspended given costs, but is still a very viable over the long-term project. We will update that forecasting. We will again scrutinize the independent system operator's view, but certainly as a lender to a project, it's our duty to make sure that's true, but we are not also the power market experts. So we would have more due diligence to do that. We would also have legal fees to finalize the contracts with a new borrower, but we would really be building on the due diligence done to date.
Thank you. I have time still. Okay, so Mr. Winfield, I mean, the implication that we heard from a previous speaker was that due diligence could be wasted money, but I would like to hear from you, your view, if the role of due diligence, given that some projects won't go ahead and some will go ahead. This one seems like there is a new owner and it will go ahead. But is due diligence not really partly the price to explore whether a project is viable or not?
I would say precisely yes, that these things need to be subject to substantial scrutiny to see if they make sense, both in economic terms and environmental terms. And the problem here seems that this project was conceptualized in a different stage in the evolution of Ontario's electricity system, at a point where we were suffering from a condition called surplus baseload generation, which basically meant that the electricity demand went below the minimum output from the system, principally from the nuclear plants, because you can't turn them down. And in those circumstances, Ontario was having to export electricity at a negative price. Literally, we were paying other people to take it off our hands. That problem is, in my view, no longer exists because we have the entire nuclear fleet in various stages of being refurbished with units coming offline. And what is very clearly happening and is projected to continue happening through the 2030s is that the marginal fuel in Ontario is natural gas, fossil gas. So any surpluses are almost certainly to be there won't be any because what capacity we have is going to be needed to meet demand in Ontario and any surplus that we generated would be from gas-fired generation.
Thank you. I just have a question again for Mr. Corey about the model that the CIB is based on. I understand that Norway has extensively used public-private partnerships or P3s. How is our P3 structure in Canada set up? Compare it with, for example, Norway or a norm elsewhere.
Thank you for the question. And yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? I think the CIB is an innovative tool, but we are far from the only ones. And you mentioned the Nordic countries actually have partnered together in a very long history around the Nordic Bank. Germany has, KfW has a similar structure. Since the CIB was launched, the UK has announced an infrastructure bank modeled, and if you were to go and read their legislation, it would be very similar. And of course, most recently, Ontario has announced plans to create something similar.
you.
So even here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corey.
Thank you, Chair.
Prochainement, nous avons M. Barcelou-Duval. À vous la parole, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Barcelo Duval, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to begin with Mr. Winfield. First of all, thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. Mr. Winfield, in your opening statements earlier, you said that apparently there would have been another solution for the Lake Erie Connector, which was a project that was suspended, which was not carried out, which consists in using Hydro-Quebec lines that already connect to the United States. I would like to know if you could, as an expert, perhaps shed some light on that. Why was this option not considered?
Thank you, Monsieur. My comments were mostly focused on the question of the relationship between Quebec and Ontario. And that, in my view, it would make far more sense to strengthen the interties between Ontario and Quebec for a number of reasons. The principal one being the nature of Hydro-Quebec's system, which has a very, very large storage capacity, which would be in many ways an ideal partner for the deployment of intermittent renewable resources in Ontario, wind and solar principally. The two could balance each other off very, very nicely in terms of Quebec helping Ontario when there was lowered output from renewables, but also when Ontario's outputs were high, they can sell to Quebec from wind. That's often in the winter where Quebec has challenges around meeting peak. And Quebec doesn't run the hydro dams. It effectively stores the energy behind the dams. There's been quite a lot of work done on this question. We worked with colleagues at HHC at the Université de Montréal on this question, and there was work done by the IESO as well about the costs of the necessary reinforcements to the interties already exist between Ontario and Quebec. The corridors are there. They would have to be upgraded, but we've got quite good costing on what that looks like. And so this seemed to make far more sense, and indeed many people have looked at this and said this would make far more sense as a way of avoiding this large increase in gas-fired generation in Ontario with all the increases in greenhouse gases that go with that. That Ontario should have focused on the relationship with Quebec. As I mentioned, Monsieur Legault made repeated overtures to Ontario about this and got no meaningful response. So this was very concerning. And frankly, I and many others could not understand why Ontario would not engage in a more constructive conversation with its neighbor to the east.
Donc, de votre perspective, en termes
So, from your viewpoint, when it comes to investments, because the Canada Infrastructure Bank is, after all, a federal institution, from the viewpoint of the federal government, that is the broader one, compared to having a company such ITC Investments or another company that would now like to set up shop in this. So in a larger perspective, beyond the CIB, this would not a type of project that would be the most appealing financially or the most appropriate. In fact, there should be more focus on the issue of finding means to better tying together Ontario and Quebec. That would be a less costly investment, and that would be more environmentally friendly. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's very much the case. There's been quite a lot of modeling done on the Ontario-Quebec relationship and the ways in which that can be optimized. So yes, that would make sense to me in terms of particularly the Federal Infrastructure Bank to be looking at financing the strengthening of the interties between Ontario and Quebec. Similar cases, though it's complicated, but of course there's the question of the Atlantic Loop and Atlantic Canada as well, and indeed between Saskatchewan and Manitoba as well, because again, Saskatchewan has very high intermittent renewable potential, but needs storage. And Manitoba has, like Hydro-Quebec, Manitoba Hydro has storage capacity in its hydroelectric system. So it would make far more sense to be focused on strengthening the east-west ties in the electricity systems in Canada than a north-south.
Merci. Monsieur Corey, est-ce que vous, à la banque,
Thank
avez
you.
eu
Mr. Corey, at the bank, have you had a similar type of thinking with respect to those questions? And I would like to ask you that question before we get to the actual project. Thank you for that question. I'll continue in English, and perhaps Mr. Gunaratna can give me a hand as well.
Absolutely agree with the idea that more transmission connections across this country are important to creating a reliable grid and meeting our electricity needs, whether that's in the Atlantic region, as Professor Winfield mentions, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, he didn't mention, but British Columbia and Alberta, there's also a similar story about creating better connections. And for sure, Ontario and Quebec. And I would say it's not a question of either or. We would absolutely be, and we have been talking to the electric utilities. I was with Hydro-Québec la semaine dernière, par exemple, just talking about their priorities and their needs for investment. Second, we're investors. We invest in projects. So when the Ontario Independent System Operator and the Ontario government say this is a project we support, meaning the Lake Erie Connector, and we think it's important to the reliability of our grid, GDP and export potential for us, and GHG emissions reductions, it's a project with benefit. We're willing to invest in it. If they also come to us and wanted to upgrade interties with Quebec, that would be very interesting for us as well. Last point I'll make, this line actually does provide benefit to Hydro-Quebec. Right now, Hydro-Quebec does not have a way to export power to PJM either. They connect to New York very well, but not to PJM. In the modeling that's been done, there is some economic benefit from Hydro-Quebec also moving power through Ontario into the U.S. market using this line.
We'll have another round of questioning, and then you could follow up and provide additional resources. Next, we have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses, all of our witnesses, for being here today. Before I start my questioning on this topic, I'd like to quickly move the motion that I put on notice at a previous meeting. I believe there's agreement amongst committee members, and that motion reads that the committee extend the study on accessible transportation for persons with disabilities by at least one additional meeting in order to hear testimony from persons with disabilities with lived experience and organizations representing persons with disabilities. And I think, while the motion says at least one additional meeting, I think we've settled on the idea of one additional meeting to hear testimony. And really the rationale for this, Mr. Chair, as folks around the table know, we heard some excellent testimony from regulators, from companies, but the testimony from people with lived experience was quite minimal. And I think the study would benefit and the report would benefit from hearing those voices at one additional meeting. So I'll move that and look forward to any discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. And we have had discussions on this. Do I have unanimous consent to adopt the motion put forward by Mr. Bachrach? Agreed. Therefore adopted. Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleagues through you. This is an interesting study because, of course, we're talking about a project that was originally analyzed and discussed by the CIB over 3 years ago. And what we're trying to understand, I think, is the CIB's thinking around the public good that's involved in these investments. The CIB isn't just an investor, it's an investor of Canadians' money. And so, we shouldn't be seeing the bank simply make investments in projects that the private sector can finance themselves unless there is some tangible public good. And so that's why the piece around greenhouse gas emissions, I think, is so interesting. And my first question is for Professor Winfield. You've heard the discussion so far, and you've heard Mr. Corey's explanation of the rationale when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. I'm wondering what other assumptions you would need to know in order to better understand the CIB's analysis of the picture 3 years ago when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, like to really understand the benefits, the climate benefits of this project. What other information would you need to know that the CIB had before them at the time?
Well, that's a complicated question. Um, it requires, I think, a fairly detailed understanding of how electricity dispatch works in Ontario and what resources would be available at any given time. And as I say, the complicating factor here is the assumption that there would be significant surplus generation available for export. And everything we're seeing in Ontario suggests the opposite. As I've mentioned, we have all of the units, virtually all the units at all of the nuclear facilities going offline over the next 20 years or so for refurbishment. Some are due for retirement as well, which has been the primary source of the surplus baseload generation, the need to export at a negative price because we're having to pay Michigan to take it off our hands. And everything we're seeing, as I mentioned, including from the ISO, is this almost vertical growth in fossil gas-fired generation and the associated greenhouse gas emissions. That was becoming apparent even as of 2014, but now is empirically apparent in the ISO's last figures that there's been a tripling relative to 2017, and I say that curve is virtually vertical out to through the 2020s. So the implication here is the marginal fuel in Ontario is fossil gas, unabated fossil gas. So it's difficult. Again, I keep coming back to this question. I can't see where the surplus generation of any significance was going to come from in over the next 20 years, given what we understand about how things are evolving in Ontario. And indeed, that question has been maximized further because there are then questions around the impact of electrification, which would increase electricity demand even further in Ontario, so that the chance of there being surplus, the ISO is telling us very emphatically, there is no surplus. They want to spend a lot of money building generation.
Professor Winfield, and I'll turn now to Mr. Corey, and I'd like to ask one more question. So if the answer can be relatively brief, based on what Professor Winfield has said, did the CIB's analysis, when you analyzed the Lake Erie Connector, did it show that there would be surplus baseload generation in light of the fact that these nuclear power plants were coming offline for refurbishment or retirement?
Thank you for the question. I'd just like to say I'd love to bring you on the road with me because your description of the CIB at your start of your comments was perfect, and I agree with every word you said. That is our job. It's okay. You can come with me, and we'll tell the story.
I'm happy to share that message across Canada.
I liked your first message. I liked your first message. The modeling. Let's just start. The modeling done by the IESO is an hour-by-hour model of all the supply in the province, imports and exports, and it's a net model. And the answer to the MP's question is that the modeling that conducted by the independent system operator, verified by our external advisor, said there were lots of hours in the year, particularly in the next 10 to 15 years, when Ontario will have clean power surplus to export. There will also be many hours in a year when Ontario will have needs to import and can import bilaterally by, for instance, contracting with a nuclear or renewable power supplier in the US and not firing a gas plant in Ontario in those really peak moments when there's an unscheduled maintenance day or a really non-windy day or a really, really hot day. So the benefits of GHG show on both sides of the border. Now, as per MP Murray's question, we will test that again because as Dr. Winfield says, conditions continue to change since 2019 and 20, and we wouldn't make the investment without verifying our due diligence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corey, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we have Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours once again. 5 minutes, please.
Yes, my question is also for Mr. Corey. Mr. Corey, I note that every year the bank reports in their annual reports how much it spends on staff and bonuses. For almost every year in its existence, the bank has spent more on salaries and overhead than on actual infrastructure projects. So let me put these numbers to you. Salaries for 2022-2023 and bonuses, $30,200,000. Salaries for 2021-2022 and bonuses, $23,973,000. Salaries for 2021 and bonuses, 17,742,000. So you get the picture. Why should Canadians who are struggling with daily living expenses not be concerned about these hefty bonuses and salaries that your non-profitable bank is dishing out?
I appreciate the question, and you're right. The CIB really does focus on transparency. You find in our annual reports all of our expenses, explanation of our bonuses, explanation of our performance targets, and when we meet them and when we don't. And the performance bonuses are just that. They're based on achievement of goals. To be clear, last year, the year that just finished, March 31st, the CIB made $3.7 billion in new investments. The year before that, we made $4.3 billion in investments. The staff costs to do that, since the CIB launched in 2018, we've been ramping up staff. So as Dr. Lewis, you've described, that's the natural function of us hiring investment professionals, market experts, folks like Minister Gunaratne, who has a long experience in both energy and banking, folks like Monsieur Duguay, who comes to us from the private sector as well. And so, yes, we've built a team. That team is getting incredible leverage on Canadian dollars by investing billions of dollars in new infrastructure projects.
Spending Canadian taxpayers' money as if it's profitable for you. You say you made this on investments. It means that you're spending out that money. That's not the revenues that you are generating. Isn't that correct?
So we're making loans, and so the revenue, the numbers I just quoted, so the $3.7 billion last year, that is correct. Those are loans that we've made in the past 12 months. The money will be loaned out and repaid over 10, 15, 20, and sometimes 30 years with interest. Over time, the CIB will evolve to being more and more self-sustaining as an organization. But to be clear, we take every taxpayer dollar extremely seriously. Our staff costs are all pursuing making the investments that both build new infrastructure and deliver the public benefits of GHG reduction, economic growth, Indigenous participation, and better connectivity of Canadians.
So the CIB, $35 billion bank, promised to make a high return 2, 4, 7 times from private sector. Tell me exactly how much money the CIB has made from private sector corporations, and I'm not speaking about pension funds or crown corporations, from the private sector. How much investment has the CIB reaped from the private sector?
So I'd just like to clarify the question, if I may. We're not seeking to make money from the private sector. We're seeking to co-invest with them. So in the Lake Erie Connector example, we were going to lend $655 million at the time in 2021 when the project was agreed. The project was a $1.7 billion project. So the other $1.05 billion was coming from the private, in that case, the investors and the shareholders, the private sector company that is Fortis. So just to be clear, we're not trying to make money from the private sector. We're trying to draw their money into infrastructure investments along with us.
Right. And you intend to be self-sufficient at some point, do you not? As a bank?
Well,
no, you always will be taking taxpayer money and lending it out to companies that have billions of dollars of their own money while Canadians are struggling to put food on the table. That's the model. That's the business model.
The model is to get infrastructure projects that are sitting on the sidelines going. And the Lake Erie Connector is a great example of that. This project has been a decade in the making and has not been built. And better connectivity of our grids is hugely important for Canadians.
But the premise of the bank was that you would have 2 to 4 to 7 times return on investment. That's what was promised to taxpayers. And now you are speaking about taxpayers' money as just money that we give out. And yeah, that's our metrics. We give the money out. And so we're successful. And we can pay $1 million bonuses to people who it appears are not doing anything because you have to hire outside consultants to do the work. Why don't your staff do the work, Mr. Corey? Why don't you have staff that can do the work and not outside consultants?
20-second response, please, sir.
2 important questions in there. Number one, we have incredible staff who do the majority of the work on any investment. We always seek outside counsel for due diligence, as Dr. Winfield has talked about, as anyone would recommend. Both legal and technical counsel makes a lot of sense when you're making an investment of this size. Number 2, we take taxpayers' money very seriously. And in looking, Dr. Lewis, at our same metrics, you would see that in the long term, we estimate that for every dollar we're investing of Canadian taxpayers' money, we are drawing $6 of private capital or so currently into those projects over the long term.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corey. Next, we have Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to our guests today. Always a very interesting conversation. Mr. Corey, when you show up, talking about CIB. Thanks for the update, by the way, and the number of projects that have been are moving forward, 70 plus, and the amount of investments that have been generated because of that. I just want to focus on process. And before I do that and ask you a question, I just want to make reference to Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland and Labrador, which you probably are well aware of what happened there. It was announced as a $5.3 billion project to be built with taxpayer money. It turned out to be a $14 billion, just about $14 billion investment of taxpayer money, which the province really couldn't afford. And it became the subject of a major commission inquiry. And during that inquiry, it was determined that this project did not have due diligence, did not have the necessary work that's being done by the CIB, for example, in some of the projects you're pursuing. And it became very controversial. And many people in the province are still angry about the fact that this was done with taxpayer dollars with very poor management over the period of years, took twice as long to build as it should. And it was an unmitigated disaster, quite frankly, is how people see it. And we, as a federal government, had to step in and assess Newfoundland and Labrador for that project. Otherwise, electricity rates would have more than doubled, even tripled. It would have been a disaster for the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. So I want to ask you to tell the committee the process that your team goes through when they receive a project proposal. What are the things that you do as due diligence?
I really appreciate the question. And maybe before I do, I'll just say one sentence. If you were to compare your Muskrat Falls example to the REM project in Montreal, for instance, which we made a loan to, and it's very publicly known, the first segment has opened. In that project, we made a loan. In that case, the KES are the equity investor. They've got billions of dollars at stake. And if you were to read the press, you would find out that that project has also gone up by cost, because lots of big projects do, more than $1 billion. We have not put any more money in. The KES and their equity investment have. And we're still going to get paid back. Taxpayers' money is still coming back every penny. And the extra investment that's had to happen as that project escalated is being borne by the people who should, because they're the ones managing the project. They have their finger on it, and they own up to that. So that's the difference when you engage the private sector with you. So when we make an investment, we follow an investment process. We receive proposals all the time from all parts of the country, from both public sectors, municipalities, provincial governments, Indigenous communities, or from the private sector. In an example like the Lake Erie Connector, we were first approached by Fortis, ITC, their subsidiary, because they couldn't make the math work on the project and do it in a way that was affordable to taxpayers, Ontario ratepayers in that case. So our due diligence starts by engaging with people like the Ontario government. Is this a project they need? Do they understand the value of it? Is it a project they want? So we would engage with the government. We engage with the proponent. We then do what's called a term sheet. So we try and sketch out what would be the terms at a high level of an agreement, and they would take that to their board, and we would take it to ours and get a test that this makes sense as an investment. And to MP Bachrach's questions earlier, that there's benefit to taxpayers. That's the fundamental question we're answering, because our job isn't to make every last penny of dollars, it's to protect taxpayers' money, but it's to get those public benefits. So that's what we're assessing. And then we go into due diligence. So now we have the terms of a deal. So to answer your question, now we go into a detailed due diligence. And we would, as is the case on this project, hire a technical advisor to help us understand the economics. A lot of it is about understanding the market, what revenue is going to come. So I'll give you a different example. If we got approached by someone who wanted to build huge wind farms in Newfoundland and create hydrogen and export it to world markets, one of the questions we need to answer is, well, what's the market for that hydrogen? Are people going to be willing to pay it? How big is that market? Because that's what we're investing in. So that's the type of due diligence. And to answer an earlier question, we don't have in our staff a person who's an expert on the hydrogen market in Germany. So we would go hire somebody to help us get that expertise. That's the due diligence we would do, and then we'd sign a loan agreement. And you can imagine, for the size of loans these are, they're hundreds of millions of dollar loans. That's a pretty substantial document. So you'd get expert opinion.
you.
We have a legal team, but we would get external legal advice as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corey, and thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. You were done?
Great answer. Thank you.
Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Barcelou-Duval. À vous la parole.
Next, Mr. Barcelou Duval, you have 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. Well, I would like to take this opportunity to table a motion. I hope that we can dispose of it quickly. The members of the committee on last March 21 will have received the following motion, which reads as this. Whereas on December 13th of this year, the House of Commons adopted the following motion, number M96, that the House recognized an assessment by the International Association of Firefighters concluded significant regulatory shortfalls concerning emergency responses at Canada's major airports are needlessly putting the safety of the flying public at risk by failing to specify rescue as a required function of airport firefighters, requiring only that firefighters must reach the midpoint of the furthest runway in 3 minutes rather than all points in operational runways within that time period. And B, in the opinion of the House, the government should, without delay, ensure that the Canadian aviation regulations reflect airport rescue and firefighting standards published by the International Civil Aviation Organization, specifically by giving firefighters at Canada's major airports the mandate and resources necessary to reach the site of a fire or mishap anywhere on an operational runway in 3 minutes or less, and specifying that a required function of firefighters be the rescue of passengers, and understanding that firefighters have as a duty to help and save passengers. From what I understand, is that the Standing Committee on Transport asks specifically the Minister of Transport to inform the committee on how his department intends to respond to the motion adopted by the House. I'm bringing this to the committee because the House adopted this on last December 13th, and I want to ensure that others in the government be informed of this. I believe that this is an important motion that was passed by the House. In fact, it was adopted unanimously, unless I'm mistaken. In my mind, it's at the very least that we maintain people informed as to the status of this, and that we're waiting for this, and we're waiting here at the committee for the response to this motion. Thank you very much, Chair. I do hope that we can unanimously agree on this motion. Thank you, Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and of course we've had a discussion. I moved a motion relating to M96 in this committee during our study on Bill C-33, where we propose to have the International Association of Firefighters, the Canadian Airports Council, and others come before this committee to discuss the impacts that making a change of this nature would have. So if we're proposing to have a discussion, I think we could have that discussion. But I would also say that we've been waiting to have this meeting regarding the Lake Erie Connector for a number of months now, and so I would move that we adjourn debate on this motion. We can have a discussion perhaps at a business meeting, but I don't think we should get into the debate at this time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Strahl. So we have a motion to adjourn debate. Do we want to go to a roll call? Let's do that. Yeah, please.
Mr. Bito?
Yes.
Monsieur Iacono?
Oui.
Madame Koutrakis?
Oui.
Ms. Murray?
Oui.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
Mr. Strahl?
Yes.
Mr. Muse?
Yes.
Dr. Lewis?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Monsieur Barcelou-Duval?
No.
Mr. Backrack?
No.
Nine yeas, 2 nays.
The motion carries. Mr. Barcelou-Duval, je vous passe la parole encore une fois. Vous
Mr.
avez...
Barcelou-Duval, I give you back the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I would like to ask a question to Mr. Corey. In a statement that you made, I think it was of May 9th, 2023, you indicated that given the cost increases, with respect to the Lake Erie Connector project. This was no longer a satisfactory project. So in that case, we were not aware that it had cost close to $2 million in consultant fees. And I understand that any major project has to do its due diligence, and sometimes this is required and necessary. And sometimes these amounts to invest may be major. However, nevertheless, $900,000 rather is a great deal of money. The information that we received is that of this, approximately $800 were for legal fees over that $900,000 in total. It seems to me extremely high. You also indicated that all of the projects, about 70 projects in total that you're currently involved in, there you incur these kinds of costs. Have such major amounts be invested in all projects? Is it normal for you to invest almost $1 million in consulting fees? You don't have any internal expertise for that? Thank you very much for that question. I'll turn it over to Mr. Duguay, who's our general counsel, just to indicate that, to go back to the last part of your question, no, it isn't necessarily normal. This is a fairly complex project given the issues of cross-border trade. So part of the legal fees consisted in better understanding the regulations applicable to the electricity markets in the United States. For each of our projects, yes, we conduct the required due diligence, and it really depends on the project. But Mr. Duguay, perhaps you would like to comment? Thank you, Mr. Corey. To answer your question, Mr. Barcelo-Duval, in all projects, specifically in such a major project of $1.7 billion, and in light of the complexity of the projects involving the Lake Erie Connector projects, where there was a legal component involving Canadian law as well as American law. Now, to answer your question, yes, we have a legal team in-house. We have an entire team that works in close collaboration with our investment team on a project's due diligence. When we move forward in a project, and when we move to an agreement in principle with a third party, when we then begin the negotiation regarding due diligence, respecting the contracts of third parties, it is at this point that we we call on external legal help. And again, as I mentioned, we needed lawyers who practice Canadian law, as well as lawyers who practice American laws based on the Pennsylvania framework of law, based on the agreements that we have in place with the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Corey, at a previous meeting of this committee, you indicated that in the medium term, this is a quote, in the medium term, we were going to be importing energy that would be less carbon intensive than using gas to fill baseload in Ontario. You say that was our analysis. So I guess that begs the question about the short term and the long term. After this project was set to come online, if the investment had gone ahead, what were the short-term assumptions around imports and exports of clean energy and the long-term assumptions around imports and exports of clean energy? In other words, to Professor Winfield's earlier point, at what point was Ontario going to be exporting clean energy? Because you say in the midterm, they're not going to be. We're going to be importing clean energy. I assume that's a net. When is the net export of clean energy from Ontario going to happen in the bank's initial analysis?
So I will for sure turn to my colleague, Mr. Gunaratne, to help answer that question. I appreciate the question from the member. But in general terms, and Sachin can help me, but in general terms, in the immediate term, this is this is for sure a net exporter. There's more power flowing from Ontario to PJM than the other way around. In the short term. Okay. In the medium term, that becomes quite as we go through the refurbishment of nuclear facilities, and as Dr. Winfield points out, as we become tighter on supply, it becomes both an importer and exporter. And I think your point about net is incredibly important. It will continue to export. There will also be imports. And then in the longer term, there is the potential for the line to be used to make larger scale clean imports from the U.S., whether that's from bilateral contracts on the nuclear fleet in PJM or with large renewable developers. So yes, the PJM grid is on average dirty, but that doesn't mean you have to import dirty power. The ISO has talked about, and if you speak to them, you may ask them this question, they've talked about contractually signing bilateral contracts with clean producers in the U.S. so that even when they're importing, it will be clean power. So I hope that answers your question. And Sachin, Mr. Gunaratne, if you'd like to add anything, please.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll add is the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers in 2021 said that Ontario wasted more than 7 terawatt hours of electricity, of clean electricity, just based on they had the electricity but no demand to use that electricity. So either it was spilled or sold to New York and Michigan at low or negative prices.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we have Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Corey, earlier in your testimony today, you said about infrastructure projects, quote, every project dies a few times before it really lives. This was in response to Dr. Lewis's question on was it a good use of $1 million for a project that was dead. So I guess my question then, if every project dies a few times before it really lives, how many other projects that have been announced by the CIB are in their dying phase and have been millions of dollars have been thrown at them when we don't know if they actually are going to go ahead? Those are your words, not mine. So how many projects do you believe are at risk that you have already done the announcements for and that you have already spent money on?
Appreciate the question, and I appreciate the replay of my adage, which, yes, I heard from an old construction hand many years ago. I think the sentiment behind it is clear. It's that large infrastructure projects are complex. They often take years to come together. This one has taken a decade, and it's still going through that. But to answer your question directly, there are 2 other projects that I'm aware of that are in a similar suspended state. One was a power project in northern Quebec. It's called the Wapmagustui project we announced in partnership with Indigenous communities in Hydro-Quebec. Again, cost escalation for that remote construction made it such that the project was paused. And the other was a project with BC Transit around the purchase of zero-emission buses for BC Transit, where we were working on a deal with all levels of government, and that project has also paused. Those are the only 2 that I'm aware of. I would say
on those 2 projects, sorry, I don't have much time. Sure. On those 2 projects that you just listed, how much did the CIB spend on external? How much money has already been gone out the door? How much taxpayer dollars has already been spent either by the bank or by external consultants that may or may not ever be useful to Canadian taxpayers? How much have you already spent on those projects that are at risk of being cancelled?
Appreciate the question. We've answered this in previous members' question, an OPQ question. I'm happy to provide the figures. Mr. Duguay has them.
So as previously reported, Mr. Chair, so for the BC Transit zero emission project that Mr. Corey is referring to, those costs total close to $85,000 in total for legal expenses and also technical advisory expenses. And on the Wapmagustui project, as previously reported to Parliament, those costs total about $185,000, again, for between legal expenses and due diligence and technical expenses as well.
Okay, so getting close to $1.3 million between these 3 projects, which are dead, that might be revived. How much time, Mr. Chair?
You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. The other question that some of these questions I would prefer to ask to the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure, who is the minister responsible for this and through whom the CIB has their parliamentary accountability. However, he has declined an invitation to appear on this study, even though he was invited by motion of this committee. So I'll ask you, he provides to you a statement of priorities and accountabilities, which is interesting considering that he won't be accountable to this committee on this issue. But he has stated that he believes that the Canada Infrastructure Bank should become a center of expertise. Now, as Dr. Lewis has pointed out, you've gone from 17 million to 21 million to over 30 million dollars now in staff and bonus costs. So you're clearly expanding the size of the CIB's cost to taxpayers in terms of its number of employees or salaries for those employees. Do you believe that you are a center of expertise on infrastructure? And if so, why, like the government, which has expanded the use of external consultants to $21 billion a year, why the need to use so many outside consultants if you are an infrastructure center of expertise?
Thank you for the question. So yes, it is a core part of our mandate, as you say, and as outlined in our statement of priorities and accountabilities. And we are absolutely fulfilling the role of providing advisory support. So, as I was mentioning in response to an earlier question from MP Rogers, our role starts with providing advisory support to the potential borrowers. It could be a public borrower, province, municipality, or Indigenous community, or to the private sector in how to structure these types of investments. We do that. We're doing that on projects like Georgina Island, where we're working with a First Nation on the potential to build a new road that connects their community, or Tulsan, which is a hydroelectric project in the Northwest Territories. We're working with the government. So yes, we provide that sort of advice on how to structure a deal. When they get to the detailed stage of investment, that's when we would bring in the third-party expertise and due diligence. And as Monsieur Duguay was describing, that would usually be both for legal, but also market and technical support. Notwithstanding that we have an incredible staff, there are market by market understanding of what's the demand and the offtake and what's the reasonable construction cost that we would go to a third party.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Corey. Next, we have Mr. Biddle. Mr. Biddle, excuse me. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please, sir.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I guess looking back, CIB isn't the first time the federal government's been involved in public-private partnerships, and the previous government was involved in P3CF, which is the Public-Private Partnership Canada Fund under the previous government. I know Mr. Strahl was here at that time. Would you be aware, would due diligence have been done at those times and under similar models? If you can explain, if you were aware of what would have been done at those times.
For sure. I appreciate the question, and I'm not personally aware. I joined the CIB in late 2020, but I can say that I have every belief that they would have conducted a similar type of due diligence. Certainly when you're investing Canadian taxpayers' money, making large-scale loan agreements like we are, I think that's an expectation that you as parliamentarians would have of us, and so I assume they did similar. In my old role, I used to work for the province of Ontario at Infrastructure Ontario. We certainly conducted similar types of technical due diligence. For instance, if we were investing in a new highway or a new hospital, we would hire a cost consultant to help us estimate was the cost reasonable, to give an example. So it's very standard, at least from my experience, and I'm sure P3 Canada did similar.
I'm wondering if you could speak to the private sector. We're talking about the CIB like it's operating in this vacuum, that it's the only one that would hire lawyers to conduct a $600 million loan and be shocked that there'd be costs coming from it. I was wondering if you can explain, perhaps from the private sector experience that you've brought with you, how a bank would operate in a similar type of experience if loaning out hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on a file.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I would say two things. One, let's just use Lake Erie as an example. If we were structuring these legal agreements, and you, I think, may have opportunity as committee members to ask the proponent of the project, whether that's Fortis, if you've invited them, or NextEra, perhaps, who may be taking over the project, ask them this question. But very clearly, our lawyers were interacting with their lawyers. Our technical advisors were interacting with theirs. And there was an earlier question about not believing the marketing materials of the proponent. And I want to be very clear. The proponent also did a technical study and had their own estimate of the GHG savings. They had their own third-party consultant do that. Respectfully, that's their number. We need to have our own independent view of that, which is why we hire due diligence. But absolutely, the private sector is doing the same on their side and then some. And I think that's reasonable and to be expected in these types of large commercial agreements, which is what the CIB was set up to do.
Do you have any sense of what the proponent spent in terms of getting this project off the ground to even get to a point where you're involved, or perhaps that's just a better question for them?
Apparently, Mr. Gunratna does have an idea, but I will just say in general, before we've spent $1 on a project, proponents have spent millions of their dollars. I could give you many examples of project proponents and the types of investment they have to make to get a project off the ground. In this case, Mr. Gunratna, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would. It was between $10 and $20 million that they spent of their own money to bring the project from when they got involved until it was suspended.
Thank you so much. And I guess looking at it, I know it's been touched briefly on in terms of the Ontario government bringing forward an infrastructure bank, and I know our government and their government don't often see eye to eye. But I was wondering if I know this is CIB has become a bit of a political football, but if it was such a failure of a model, can you comment as to why the Ontario government set up a very similar model within the province?
I would never suppose to speak for them, but I've had lots of discussions, I think, in their lead up and in their planning. And I think similar to us, what they see is that we have a very simple problem. All of us agree we need more infrastructure at every level of government. It's actually one of the few, you talk about a political, it's one of the few issues that actually has unanimity. I could ask a mayor or a premier or a prime minister of any political party. They would all agree we need to get more built faster. Number one. And actually, the reason we don't is very simple. We can't afford it all. The cost of our infrastructure needs exceed our ability to, and there are studies that talk about the hundreds of billions of dollars needed to be spent in this country. And so the only way to do that is find a way to draw in private and institutional pools of capital into these projects. And the only way to do that, they're big companies, but they also make smart investment decisions based on math. And for many of these projects that are very long, 20, 30, 40-year lives with high uncertainties, is to find a partnership. That's the whole point of public-private partnerships, where we can share with them, not take, but share with them the risks of those projects, the upfront investment hurdle of those projects. And that's what the CIB is here to do. And I think Ontario sees that as a way to similarly draw more investment and more infrastructure built at the end of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Biddle, and thank you, Mr. Corey. Next, we have Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to go back to questions that my colleague, Dr. Lewis, was asking, because in the fiscal year 2023-24, or sorry, fiscal year that ended 2022-23, the CIB had $46 million in operating costs, and of that, 8.1 million were bonuses. So that's 18% of your operating costs. That's bonuses. That seems like a very excessive amount. And do you think that's justifiable? And certainly that can't compare to what the private sector is paying.
So appreciate the question. In that same fiscal year, let's just start with with a general sense. The CIB made investments in projects of our money of $4.3 billion in projects that had total capital value of between $12 and $13 billion. We did that with an internal staff of just over 100 people in offices in Toronto, Montreal, and Calgary. And our compensation structure is benchmarked rigorously to the private sector. We hire from a pretty wide sector of Canadian banks, professional industry groups. We hire engineers. We hire investment professionals. People who work at the CIB come because they believe in the public sector mission of the bank, and they take compensation that does not match what they can get in the private sector, but it does need to be at least competitive. So that's why we benchmark. And it's a mix of base salary and bonus that is benchmarked. And we're extremely transparent in what our performance goals are and if we meet them or not. And that's what our performance compensation is linked to.
I would find that 18% of your operating expenses being used on bonuses to be excessive, but we'll disagree on that. When you were last here when you were here, I think you were here since then, in May of 2023, so just about a year ago, I asked you about internal audit processes and transparency, and you talked about the need to improve transparency, but yet we're looking at a project today that's been shrouded in secrecy. We've had to have, questions in question period. We've had to order paper questions in order to draw out some of those details and find out the volume of taxpayer money that's been wasted. And so I guess my question is this what you would view as an improvement in transparency?
So appreciate the question. And maybe just in answer to the follow-up, just to be clear, at the CIB, our internal costs are only made up of salary and staff costs, some office rent, and some computers. We're a knowledge-based organization. So the fact that salaries make up the majority of our expense is actually not in my mind surprising. The balance between base compensation and variable compensation, as I say, is designed to make our performance transparent and our compensation linked to actually meeting the tangible goals we set, not only in dollar deployment, but in achieving outcomes like number of new homes connected to broadband, number of Indigenous communities with access to better infrastructure, et cetera. Now, to the question about transparency, I think the CIB, have made significant investment in our transparency. And Monsieur Duguay, who, as our general counsel, also leads much of our work around transparency, can speak to this. But our publishing, whether it's on our internal expenses, our salary costs, you're quoting to us our salary costs because we try and always provide up-to-date, accurate, and transparent information around all of the money we're spending, including on projects, including on third parties, which you can also see in our reports.
Sure, although we had to produce order paper questions to extract some of that information. Let me switch gears and ask Mr. Winfield then. You talked in your opening remarks about audit practices and I guess grounding for projects. And it seems to me that from what you've described here, that it was fairly obvious quite some time ago that this particular project was not one that was going to be successful, that the assumptions that were being made were not were off base. And so, here we have $1 million of taxpayers' money wasted, majority of which, by the way, on lawyers and not engineers, for a project, of this type. So, I mean, what's your comment on that? I mean, in terms of this seems to be avoidable.
Yes, I mean it's a little complicated because sometimes you have to spend a little bit of money up front to recognize that there's a problem, which does potentially avoid a much bigger expenditure down the road. So there's obviously a rationale for spending some money on a project if you're going to take it seriously. The questions arise though is what do you do with that initial analysis? I would have thought anybody looking at the Ontario electricity system at that stage would have had some pretty serious questions about where this was going and where it fit. And so the fact they proceed anyway is the part that worried me more. As I say, sometimes that upfront investment in the due diligence makes sense to avoid the bigger loss down the road. And some people might point in the direction of Muskrat Falls that way. The problem was the upfront assessment was ignored. So that would be my comment there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Winfield. Next, we'll go to Mr. Yacono. Mr. Yacono, la parole est à vous. 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie.
You have 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Corey, I really enjoyed your statement where you indicated that even once a project has been suspended several times, there's always a hope that it will be reactivated. That means a cat has 9 lives. It's a bit like that. So let's speak about its raison d'être, its reason for being. And you mentioned this. You answered questions by my colleagues, whether or not there were other projects. You said directly that there are 2 others. Could you explain the reasons behind this? Why this suspension? Is it because the project is no longer viable, or is it because of the costs of producing the projects? The costs that arrived or that might occur in the future by surprise. Thank you for that question.
two things. Every project has 9 lives. I think that's another way of stating maybe more eloquently my earlier point. So I appreciate that. What's interesting, of course, is construction projects in this country went through a significant challenge in and around the time that this project was suspended around cost escalation. And as I said, committee members here would know better than anyone what has happened in the tightness of our labor markets, global cost of materials, whether that's steel, the concrete that went into these projects. There have been huge increases. So if there's a trend I could point out, because it's true for the Lake Erie Connector, it was for sure true for the Wamagustui hydroelectric project. Between the time that the idea was launched and there was an alignment between parties and we signed a term sheet between there and final investment, what happened in those cases was significant cost escalation. And to Dr. Winfield's earlier comment, much better to discover that in that due diligence phase than later. The reason those projects are suspended and that they have 9 lives is the underlying rationale for them remains very strong. The need for new sources of clean power in northwestern Quebec didn't go away. The need for better transmission connectivity between Canada and the U.S. did not go away. So in the long term, the project has real viability still in our view.
Merci. Il est intéressant de constater que mes collègues
Thank you.
conservateurs
It's also interesting to see that my conservatives and my other colleagues here at the committee are questioning the value of the CIB, whereas the Conservative Premier of Ontario has announced his own infrastructure bank. So I'm wondering this. Would you agree in saying that the announcement of the Ontario Infrastructure Bank announcement is an approval of our current model? Thank you for that question. I always try to stay away from political issues. At the CIB, our role consists in increasing infrastructure investment in Canada. Yes, but the fact that Ontario will have its own infrastructure bank, will this facilitate your work in order to see more projects being carried out in Ontario? Yes, good question, and absolutely yes. According to our view, this is a true opportunity for a partnership between us and the Ontario Infrastructure Bank. This will increase the number of projects for us, and I hope for them as well. I imagine that that's the case.
all of us need more infrastructure. I look at that and say, all of us need love. So just tell us, you've been in this field for quite a bit of time. Since 2015, has infrastructure doubled compared to the previous 10 years? And is that due to the CIB?
So, thank you for the question. The idea of an infrastructure bank, to be clear, we're a tool in the toolkit. So we don't presume, and we're pretty humble about this. It takes all of us. And to answer your earlier question about the Ontario Bank, someone once asked me, like, oh, are you going to be competing for the same deals? There is enough to go around. We need all hands on deck to build the infrastructure we need. We are one tool, and I think there's a great opportunity. But directly answering your question, yes, we are now the projects the CIB has invested in the last 3 years since I joined, or in the last 5 years since we staffed up, represent $35 billion of infrastructure projects that were stuck on the sidelines. The math didn't work. The risk was too big. The term was too long. There's something broken. And the market wasn't doing those projects on their own. And the CIB, by entering, helped facilitate those projects. So yes, I think we've played an important role in accelerating infrastructure investment in the country.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your involvement with the TRAN in Quebec.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corey. Merci, Monsieur Iacono. Monsieur Barceau-Duval, à vous la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Iacono. Mr. Barcelot-Duval, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to take this opportunity to come back to the 900,000 consulting fees. It seems to me that that is an important amount. I'd like to come back to that. Over that $900, $800 represent legal fees. I believe it's $25,000 for financial expertise, $60,000 for expert knowledge in electricity and GHG's knowledge, but $800,000 legal fees for American and Canadian markets. We all keep in mind when we're speaking about these expenses, we receive bills, we don't pay, we don't look at them, we simply pay, like it happened with ArriveCan. I'm not saying that that's the case here, I don't know. But we do need to have that instinct to be worried when we see such high figures. And I think that when you look at high figures, I think at the end of the day, we tend to lose sense of what is real. That's 800,000, 800 million, etc. So for the ordinary Canadian, what does this mean? $800,000. And I'm sure that they're not, your consultants are not paid $20 an hour. They're usually quite well remunerated. But are they paid 10 times more than this? That means that would have worked 4,000 hours on your project. Perhaps it's less, it might be more. But could you give us a sense of the overall amount? So how many companies were involved? What would be the hourly rate? What is the average hours they've devoted to this project? This seems to be extremely high, and I'm trying to understand this. I'll give it over to Mr. Dubé to speak to that issue. Thank you for that question. Well, there were a number of questions. If I may, first of all, I'd like to answer the general procurement issue, the legal services. For legal services, when we reach a point where an investment moves ahead as part of our investment process, and when we find ourselves in a negotiation, legal drafting phase, as well as due diligence phase of the project, essentially decision is made as to the fact that we require perhaps on-site expertise. We have a legal team working with us. We have some 12 lawyers who also work in partnership with our investment teams to structure the project. But for this type of major project, for this billion-dollar projects, we simply don't have the necessary staff to manage the project internally. So we do require outside expertise. Now, with respect to procurement, well, and also vis-a-vis our commitments to transparency, and again, this is all available on our website. With respect to legal fees, we have a project process in place where we launch a call for tender. On average, 3 to 5 legal firms are approached to first assess what is required. We also assess the hourly rates that are presented for a given project, and we ensure that there is no conflict of interest. But more specifically, how many hours of work are we speaking about? How many hours were billed? Because it's always the number of hours worked when it comes to lawyers. I'd like to get a sense of the average hourly rate. Let's look at the connector project. I think the CIB was involved as of 2019 on this project. In 2021, we had provided approval on the investments of 355 million. And I think for several months there were important negotiations underway, not only with third parties. Could you perhaps provide us with that answer in writing? Because perhaps we don't have time to get that right now. I think it would be very interesting to obtain the hourly rates for that. Mr. Chair, yes, we will provide this in writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking through the communications that came out around the time that the bank, approved in principle its participation in this project, and I'm not finding any mentions of importing power from the United States. So we have a quote here from Mr. Corriveau with the bank, who said that the expectation is that energy will flow from Ontario to PJM over the long term, given that Ontario has a much higher share of lower marginal cost sources of supply, which is typically non-emitting compared to PJM. Again, this is directly contrary to what we heard from Professor Winfield. In the press release that the CIB put out, here's a quote from you, Mr. Corey. This project will allow Ontario to export its clean, non-emitting power to one of the largest power markets in the world, and as a result, benefit Canadians economically while also significantly contributing to greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the PJM market. Let's go down and hear from the then Minister, Catherine McKenna. What does she have to say? With the U.S. pledging to achieve a carbon-free electricity grid by 2035, Canada has an opportunity to export clean power, helping to reduce emissions, maximize clean power use, and make electricity more affordable for Canadians. Like, it just seems like an incredible sales job when the actual rationale that you've explained to us today was that in the midterm, you're going to be a net importer of American power, and in the long term, probably also a net importer of American power, whether clean or otherwise. Why didn't the bank come clean at the beginning and articulate that this, largely was going to be a project that imported American power to Ontario?
Thank you for the question. I'd love to clarify. We're using short and middle and long terms in probably different senses. And let's just go back to some core facts. This project, remembering that the project will both import and export power throughout its life. It's a net question. First 10 years, 4 million tons of GHG reductions estimated by the ISO and verified by our external advisor in Ontario. So that's from importing power instead of turning on a gas plant in Ontario in the first 10 years. 7 million tons of reduction in the US in that same time frame. Go out longer term. Those benefits continue to accrue on both sides of the border at slower rates because all markets become tighter and all markets become cleaner. And so the amount of GHG emission savings gets less and less over the 40 years of the life, but they continue on both sides of the border. The project, over the 8,760 hours in any given year, will both import and export. I think I stand by everything in the quote you read from my quote from all the quotes, but certainly mine remains true. Everything I said is true. It is a great opportunity for both for all three of grid reliability, economic benefit, and GHG benefit for Ontario and Ontarians. And the Minister of Energy in Ontario, Minister Smith, in his ministerial directive issued in 2022, thought the same, as does the independent system operator.
The thing that stands out to me, Mr. Corey, is the lack of any mention of importing American power. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe because it's less palatable to Canadians to invest so heavily in a project that's importing electricity from the United States. But be that as it may, there's a real question based on what Professor Winfield has said, and he's studied this in great detail, about the core rationale behind the project and whether or not it's actually going to, because Ontario is now awash in fossil gas electricity. And looking forward, as we heard from Professor Winfield, emissions are going to go through the roof. And I think that's something that should concern all Canadians and should certainly concern the Infrastructure Bank. But given that I only have 5 minutes left, 20 minutes
20
left?
seconds, sir.
20 seconds.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, you're so generous. I would like to move the following motion. That the committee do order all documents and correspondence related to the Canada Infrastructure Bank's modeling and analysis of the greenhouse gas implications of the Lake Erie Connector project, and that such documents be delivered to the committee no later than May 15th, 2024.
Thank you very much, Mr. Backrack. Any discussion on that? Any comments? Questions? Yes, Ms. Katrakis.
I would like to ask for suspension, please, to discuss this a little bit further.
Okay. The committee will suspend for 5 minutes to allow members to discuss. The meeting stands suspended. I believe, have been discussions while we were suspended, whereby the witnesses have agreed to resubmit the information that's already been submitted by the latest date put forward in the motion. And do you want to withdraw your motion, Mr. Bachrach?
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I understand that the witnesses did provide some information and not everyone on the committee was privy to that. So perhaps something was missed. And if that information indeed answers the questions that we have around the modeling and analysis, it'll be very helpful. So I'm happy to withdraw my motion for now, and we can look at the information that's been provided. And if we still have further questions, we can bring back a motion at a future date.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach, and I'll work with the clerk to ensure that all that information is once again redistributed to all members. Okay, we will now resume line of questioning, and for that, I'll turn the floor over to you. Dr. Lewis, you have 5 minutes, please.
Yes, Mr. Corey, I understand that Andre Lee's method was appointed to the Infrastructure Bank Board, and she previously served on the board of SDTC, a billion-dollar green slush fund company with under multiple investigations. Now, Ms. Method had a interest in companies that received $42 million while on the SDTC board. Do you know who appointed Ms. Method to the Infrastructure Bank Board?
Thank you for the question. Appointments to the CIB board are it's an independent board of directors appointed, Frederick can help me here, but appointed by the government.
Yeah, so in accordance with our act, our directors are appointed by the governor and council. That follows the open and transparent process for director selection process that is used across government, across agencies of government and crown corporations.
So it was suggested by probably someone in government. By cabinet.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Ms. Koutrakis.
Yeah, I'm just questioning relevance to the matter at hand that we are looking at today. I just want to have a better understanding the relevance of your line of questioning vis-a-vis what we are looking at today.
It's on transparency and largely the way that the taxpayers' funds are used, which ties into the wasted funds that we saw on the Lake Erie project. So it's all around the issue of transparency. And my next question pertains to that with respect to the apparent conflict of interest that is raised. Have you raised an apparent conflict of interest with Ms. Method?
Mr. Chair, so we, with our board of directors, have adopted a code of conduct for directors that includes our procedures for conflicts of interest. That's also publicly available on our website. So upon Ms. Method's appointment, and I would say upon the appointment of all directors who are appointed on the board of directors, directors have to complete a director and officer questionnaire to disclose material interests. And if there is any project with respect to that would raise a real potential or apparent conflict of interest with a director, that is managed appropriately with respect to that director recusing themselves from the meeting and the voting on the matter, and also excluding materials from the director.
So specifically, can Canadians be assured that monies did not go to Ms. Method's businesses that she has ownership interest in from the Infrastructure Bank?
We're speaking about two different things. So there's a conflict of interest on a project that a director may have a conflict. They may have a conflict where it's direct because they sit on the board of directors of an entity that we may provide a loan to, or it may be indirect or perceived because they may have a close family member or a close friend that is related to that particular project.
Right. So
in that situation, the appropriate approach with respect to managing a conflict of interest is through disclosure and recusal, and that's how we manage conflicts that may arise on our investments with respect to entities that may be related to our directors or that they may have.
But Canadians see an apparent conflict, and they want to know that they want assurances that money from the CIB did not go to her companies when she was sitting on boards that were affiliated with it and then sitting on the CIB's board. Can Canadians have that assurance is what I'm asking you. Do your processes guarantee that assurance?
Our processes are robust such that directors are required to disclose all of their interests on boards that they serve and in respect to their private interests. And we are robust in our procedures in
Mr. Chair.
managing those conflicts.
Sorry, I have a point of order. Yes, Mr. Biddle.
I have to agree with Ms. Koutrakis. This is a study with respect to the Lake Erie connector, and I thought there was going to be some tie back from this individual back to the Lake Erie connector, but it seems to be I know we're talking about Lake Erie and there's fishing that goes on Lake Erie, but this is a broad definition of fishing and has seemingly zero connection to what the committee is actually studying.
Thank you, Mr. Biddle. Thank you. 30 seconds left, Dr.
Okay,
Lewis.
will you be paying bonuses this year from the CIB?
So as I mentioned earlier, thanks for the question. We publish our balanced scorecard that we measure ourselves against, and that's goes to Parliament. It's part of our disclosure. We, for the year that just completed, March 31st, we are still are in the process of tabulating our results for the year, taking those to our board, getting approval. So too early to say, but if you were to look at our balanced scorecard, we have met or exceeded many of our objectives.
Thank you,
We've
Mr.
missed on a
Corey.
few. And it's the board's discretion from there.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Lewis. And we'll end today with a line of questioning by Ms. Koutrakis. À vous la parole. 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have the floor, 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Today and for answering all the questions to the best of your ability. It's definitely very helpful to this committee. Mr. Corey, I want to go back to your testimony before this committee on May 9th, 2023. At the time, you had said, and you said it again in your comments today, that due to cost escalations, both the CIB and the private sector operator, ITC, and I quote, deemed that given the cost increases on the Lake Erie Connector project was no longer good value for money. Do you continue to share that opinion today, having heard that, there is a new partner that's looking at it? Do you still feel the same way?
Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. I would honestly say it's a bit too early to know for sure. The new proponent who acquired the rights to the project around the new year, December or January, are doing their own work on revised cost estimate. As I said, 2022 was particularly challenging from a escalation of core inputs perspective. It's also, as I mentioned earlier, a very specialized kind of construction. This is trenching. There's only a few boats in the world that can actually do this kind of deep trenching and laying of a high voltage bidirectional cable. So you also have to worry about when you can get a boat that can do this. So the new owner, who I think may be appearing before the committee, have been doing some work. The answer to your question for us is, as investors, it's our job to receive their updated cost estimate. On the other hand of that equation, the government of Ontario is doing their modeling and updating their modeling, and they need to determine their updated view of the value to Ontario ratepayers. Because at the end of the day, what this contract is a contract between the ISO, which represents Ontario ratepayers. They're willing to pay an amount for this line. And if that math has to work. So the province of Ontario has to determine that they want to proceed at a price that they're willing to do, and then we can lend to the project. So that's what we'll need to figure out in the months ahead. But as I said earlier, better grid connectivity across east and west across our country, but also north and south with our neighbors. A more robust grid makes more reliability. It makes lower power prices for everybody, and it makes better GHG outcomes for everybody. And so in the long run, we hope that this project and many like it do proceed, and we'll see.
Great. And who was responsible for the decision to suspend the Lake Erie Connector project in the first place?
Was the thank you, the proponent themselves, because quite simply at that point they had negotiated a price from Ontario. They had a loan from us. They had their own private financing, and they had their return hurdle rate. And then once their costs went up, the project didn't pencil for them anymore, and they couldn't do it. So they decided to suspend.
Was the CIB ever consulted before the cancellation?
We were, and as was Ontario, but frankly, the proponent had to do their math in their commercial interest, and at that point, they couldn't make it work. We weren't going to put more money into the project. Ontario wasn't going to increase the price. So that left it to the proponent to decide, and they obviously decided they needed to suspend.
Do you need to incur additional due diligence costs by going into this? Next era?
MP Murray was asking this question, I think, a little bit earlier. We will build off of all the work that's been done to date, and it's extremely useful. But we will, for sure, want to do an updated look at both, all three of project costs, GHG impacts, and then the legal documentation and finalizing of what is a pretty hefty contract. So there will be some more due diligence costs. They won't. They will all build on what's been done to date.
You said in your opening remarks that the due diligence cost for this project represents less than 0.1% of CIB's announced investment of $655 million. Is that a regular rate? I mean, you know, my background, I worked at CIBC Wood Gundy for many years and then Raymond James, and I remember seeing many IPOs and term sheets. Is that a rate that's competitive? Would you say it's below? Are fees expected to be higher than that? So where are we in terms of value received for the $900,000?
That's a great question. And so we do benchmark it across projects, and the due diligence costs of this project were higher than average. And you heard me when I was talking about the other two projects that have been suspended. If you notice, those numbers are much smaller. So this is a more complex project. But as a percent of, it's also one of our largest, it would be one of our larger investments. Our largest investment to date is the REM, which was $1.3 billion. We have other significant investments in the $500 million to $1 billion range, but this is a big one. So the due diligence costs were higher, but as a proportion of the investment, they're quite small and highly competitive. And when you benchmark to, and we do as well, when we talk to other institutional investors, when we talk to the pension funds, they would say that it's actually quite a competitive rate. And the last thing I'll say about that, one of the things that the CIB we've been very focused on is bringing that cost down, thinking about standardized tools and projects. So this is a very bespoke project. It's a one of one. No one else is building wires underneath Lake Erie. But when we do loans for zero-emission bus fleets, which we've done with the City of Ottawa, City of Brampton, Durham Region, school bus operators in Quebec, etc., we've tried to create standard documents, standard legal terms, lower due diligence costs. So we are trying to do that on every deal where feasible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corey. Thank you, Ms. Katrakis. And a thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing before us today and for providing their feedback and their testimony to this study. I will now adjourn the meeting.